funding for housing. Ms. Hogan, and subsequent to your audit, could this be a potential solution to help some Indigenous nations? Well, if there are organizations that can help First Nations communities who have a better opportunity or better success. We haven't done an audit of all those. We can only do the federal government. But see, if the Indigenous Services Canada can prioritize capacity building, that is to create capacity in a community will help with self-determination. Rather than just give them money today to fund a given issue of the day. It's the long-term focus that is best. Thank you very much. Next.
You have the floor for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank the Auditor General for this important report. We're experiencing the consequences of systemic racism. It's clear we've had decades now of consecutive governments that have led to the Auditor General's comments this morning. How irresponsible consecutive governments can be to lead to the death of individuals because they're First Nations. That is ultimately the discussion we're having today. The consequence of not having houses in northern Alberta and living outside in -50 weather is death. The numbers coming out of Alberta, for instance, in just the city of Edmonton was over 3,000 individuals were houseless, an increase that was larger and paled in comparison to every year prior. These kinds of continuous lack of care, lack of responsibility, and lack of trust continues to placate Canadian society. I'm disturbed by the findings of the Auditor General. I want to thank her team for conducting such a report and the decades-long work of the Auditor General's office to continuously raise the alarm. I've been here now just over 2 years, and the amount of reports we've seen with the failure of Indigenous Services Canada to provide the kind of quality homes, to provide the kind of quality living that Canadians expect to live in is just not there. And there is a huge systemic problem where the Auditor General, in just a few months from now, will come back to this table to speak about another atrocity that continues with this government's endless ignorance of systemic racism within Indigenous Services Canada. And what we'll see is perhaps another decade of policy that continues to result in the deaths of my relatives. It's simply unacceptable. We need accountability. We need change. And I need my colleagues to be serious about this, to understand this. That this is the most fundamental issue in our society. That if we can't actually help those that we've come into treaty with, what kind of country is Canada? We are not honorable partners. We're failing. And we've been failing for generations. It's just not acceptable. The fact that in Alberta, if we turn our attention to page 2 of the report on inequitable funding for communities with the poorest housing conditions, point 2.34, according to an analysis by Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation in 2023, the impact of not updating its formulas resulted in First Nations in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba being significantly underfunded and therefore not receiving their equitable share of funding. For example, in 2022, the Alberta region received about $19 million in funding, which is pennies. Had the formula been updated to use recent census data, the region would have received about $35 million. The corporation determined that the region had been underfunded by more than $140 million from the period of 2008-9 to 2022-23. How a cabinet minister could sit around a table and approve a budget without even asking the question as to how the condition of their number one partner is supposed to be, what kind of government do we have? A government that doesn't care, is benefiting from the systemic racism that they've inherited, and are complicit in the deaths of my relatives. It's not acceptable. I know that as soon as I'm done here today in this discussion, this topic will continue to not be discussed. It'll continue to be pushed under the rug. Ministers will continue to say that they did a real good job. The opposition will continue to move on in their schedules, and Indigenous people will be left without a home at the end of all of this. Who benefits and who loses from these continuous decisions that hurt communities? The fact that since 2001, we've been using a 2001 census for the formula for Indigenous communities. How unfair is that? Like, someone has to be held responsible for this. Someone has to apologize. Someone has to take accountability for such gross neglect. Simple neglect has resulted in a major catastrophe. The fact that we couldn't even update a formula to provide equity for my region in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, one of the most simplest things you can do. Just look at the formula and make sure it's updated. That wasn't done. What gross neglect this is. In addition to the fact that we have the lack of knowledge of smaller communities of these programs. How are they expected to provide the kind of cooperation to the government when the government's the one sitting on their hands, waiting for someone to put their hand up and say, yeah, that issue I told you about in the 1980s, even stemming further, but it's still going on. The mold, the collapsed houses, the lack of clean water, yeah, that's still happening. Why is it they have to continuously say that every fiscal year to get to the same fact? Communities are running out of time. They're running out of resources, and they're running out of hope.
Mr. Digital, you're almost out of time. Do you have a question for the auditor? I don't want to cut you off, but
I don't have any questions,
okay, that's
Mr. Chair, because it's very clear to me that the Auditor General understands this issue, this systemic issue that's present to Canadians. I want to see accountability. I need to see our colleagues join across party lines to get to the bottom of this. We need to have accountability, and we need clarity as to what we tell those folks who have no home or have lost their home or have no hope of ever getting one. When we don't supply support for First Nations communities at home in their communities, they end up in urban centers.
And
they end up in a tragedy.
We will come back to you shortly.
Mr. Chair, I'll continue on in my responses, but I just want you to know that I hope that we have support from this in our committee to look and investigate this issue seriously and get to the bottom of this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Beginning our second round, Mr. Vierson, you have the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Most of my questions will be around the National Trade Corridors Fund report from the Auditor General, and I want to thank the Auditor General for being here today. One of the interesting things around the report is generally okay. You say that they're doing a reasonable job in assessing the need and making good decisions on where to go with it. We're just not getting a follow-up at the end. One of my criticisms of this government is that they generally make their measure of success how much money they spend on a project or on anything, but not whether we get any result for this. And this seems to be another one of those cases. Would you agree with that, or would you say they are getting the results, we're just not managing it to measure it, essentially?
Well, I would offer up that this program has committed almost $4 billion to infrastructure projects to help the fluidity and resiliency of transportation corridors, but very few has been spent so far. Only around 700 million or so it's about 20%. There are very few projects, I think only 30 that have been completed out of 181 that have been approved so far. So it is still early days. What we did find when it came to results measurement was that Transport Canada did not include good measures to look at outcomes. They were really measuring what I'll say are outputs, number of roads or an extra port added. And they recognize that and actually have designed new measures for outcome. They're using them now in some of the newer agreements that are signed. The most recent 9 agreements include those new ones. But it's not too late to go back and make sure that going forward, Transport Canada gathers the information to know whether or not the funds invested will actually improve the fluidity of the corridors. And these projects are lengthy. And so and it will also take time to show those results. So you need to track trends over many years, and it's time to make sure that recipients of the funding understand their commitment back to the government to demonstrate that there's been improvement in the corridors.
Were you satisfied that when they started the program that they had that the government had a reasonable baseline? Because I noticed that achievement, what they were trying to achieve was improving the flow of people and goods in Canada, increasing the flow of trade in and out of Canada, help the transportation system withstand the effects of climate change. But improve and increase these numbers need to have an understanding of what the baseline is. If we're just adding a new airport, is that increasing? Did they have a good baseline when they started?
So we found that they used a lot of data over many sources and were well informed as they designed the calls. So this program so far has been rolled out with 7 different calls, and that each call targeted a specific need, whether it was seen as a bottleneck in transportation corridors or a gap when it comes to making sure that infrastructure is climate resilient. So they did a good job having evidence to support the calls, and then even having open and transparent criteria to select the recipients, like who would be eligible for the program. So it was well designed and well informed by data, which is different than what we're seeing in our Indigenous reports, where data is often not gathered and decisions aren't well informed. But in the corridors, it was a great example of well informed decision making.
How much time do I have left, Mr. Chair?
1 minute.
All right. I'm just going to jump just to the policing report just for 1 minute. In a similar, I don't remember exactly. I didn't know what paragraph that was on, but you said that the RCMP did not collect enough information to make a reasonable assessment as to the impact of it. Of the program. Were you able to reach out to communities and get their assessment? Because the RCP could come back and say, well, we didn't collect the information, but communities are generally satisfied with what's happening. Were you able to collect enough information to get an assessment as to whether this program was working or not?
I think if I point to a couple of the findings in our report, that the RCMP wasn't tracking, and one of the main requirements of the agreement is to dedicate a police officer 100% of the time to a community. Yeah. The First Nations Inuit policing program is meant to supplement core policing services that are already available in the province or territory, and that it is supposed to be proactive and community-based, so respecting the culture and the traditions of the community. They could not show us, there were very few, I think it was 38% of the detachments that could show us that they were tracking that a resource was spending 100% of their time in the community. But yeah, I think one of the more important things is many of the positions that are funded were going unstaffed. In the last year, 61%. So even if we had reached out to those communities, there are communities where there's 61 police officers were expected to be across the country, and they're not there because of a staffing shortage. The issue isn't just about not gathering the data. While that's important, it's about also having the resources to meet the needs under the agreements that have already been signed between the federal government, the province or territory, and the communities.
Okay. Thank you. That is your time, I'm afraid.
Thank you.
I'll turn now to Ms. Yip. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the Office of the Auditor General for coming so early this morning and tabling the report, and also for your work on these spring reports. I'm perplexed why there's so little progress in improving the housing conditions for First Nations, and why is it the 4th time that we are looking at the same issue?
So, I echo your sentiments. I'm rather discouraged that it's been 20 years and there is little progress despite the amount of money that has been invested. I would point to some of my predecessors. I would tell you that, Sheila Fraser at the end of her mandate said that the failures of of the government in meeting the needs of First Nations communities was unacceptable.